Hey everyone, Jakinto here. Today I'll be going over active tanking versus off tanking for the Blood Death Knight. I'll be covering what active tanking and off tanking are, and how you're able to do each of those effectively. These terms mostly apply to raids, but I'll go over how this can apply to Mythic Plus as well towards the end of the video. So if we look at all of the raid boss encounters in Castle Nathria, we can split the encounters up into two categories. The first category is active tanking, where you're actively tanking a boss or adds throughout the whole fight, and you're constantly taking damage. The second category is off tanking, where you're taunting off with the other tank. So there's going to be periods of times where you're not actually tanking the boss and not taking damage. The active tanking bosses in Castle Nathria would be Huntsman Altimore, Council of Blood, Sludgefist, and Stone Legion Generals. The off-tanking bosses in Castle Nathria would be Shriekwing, Hungering Destroyer, Artificer Zymox, and Lady Enerva Darkvein. The two outliers of Sun King Salvation and Sire Denathrius have a combination of active tanking and off-tanking within the fight. We're first going to look at active tanking bosses, and how you can effectively perform in these fights. The most active tanking boss in Castle Nathria is probably Sludgefist, as you're constantly taking damage. For this fight, the only breaks in active tanking that you get is when Sludgefist is stunned after hitting a pillar. Because you're taking so much constant damage, you're really going to have to be sure to rotate your cooldowns effectively. Now what does this mean as a Blood Death Knight? You ideally want to avoid excessive overlaps of your cooldowns. For example, if you have Icebound Fortitude up, you don't want to use a rune tap during this time as well. You'd want to use this rune tap charge another time to smooth out the damage over the whole fight. You also want to make sure you're using your cooldowns and not just holding them for when you drop to really low health. By rotating your cooldowns, you'll be able to avoid large spikes in your health, and it'll give you more time to build up runic power more easily. Always make sure you're above 5 stacks of Bone Shield to have that ossuary active, and never drop your Bone Shield stacks, as that's when you become super squishy and are very susceptible to being one-shot. While actively tanking, a good rotation of your cooldowns would look like this. On pull, use Rune Tap and Dancing Rune Weapon. Once that expires, if you're seeing your health dip a bit, pop Vampiric Blood. Using Vampiric Blood early on is very important if you're running Red Thirst, as you'll be able to get it up again really quickly. When Vampiric Blood is up, you can transition into another Rune Tap to further mitigate some damage there. By rotating your cooldowns in this way, that should give you at least 30 seconds to build up a good amount of runic power where you aren't taking a whole lot of damage. After that, you can use an Icebound Fortitude, especially if you need prolonged amount of mitigation time. Also work Lichborn into that rotation, especially if you have the Hardened Bones conduit taken. Apart from rotating your cooldowns and keeping your Bone Shield stacks above 5, make sure you're using as many Heart Strikes as you can to generate runic power. And remember not to Death Strike right when you took a little bit of damage. Make sure you're dropping sufficiently low before your Death Strike. Generally, if you're dropping below 50 to 60% health, you're definitely safe to use a Death Strike. But if you only took 10 to 20% of your maximum health, and you know you can take another hit, it might be worth just saving it for the next hit. So overall, for these active tanking fights, your goal is to rotate your cooldowns effectively and use your Death Strikes effectively. Make sure you're not overlapping cooldowns excessively. Don't use Icebound Fortitude, Vampiric Blood, and Rune Tap all together. It is a waste. I know it can be hard not to do that, especially if you drop low in health and you're panicking. But if you're rotating your cooldowns throughout the fight, you'll be able to avoid these spikes in health, and it'll really help you in the long run and throughout the whole fight. Now we're going to talk about how you'd approach the off-tanking fights. So in an off-tanking fight, there's usually some kind of taunt swap mechanic. Usually a taunt swap would occur after the tank who currently has the boss has taken a large hit. For example, during Hungering Destroyer, the tank swap would occur after the tank is hit with Overwhelm. So how do you go about approaching these kind of fights? When you're tanking the boss, you want to have the same principles as we talked about for the active tanking fights. Make sure to rotate your cooldowns and use your Death Strikes effectively, but you always want to have at least a Rune Tap up for that big tank hit. Since Rune Tap is on a 25-second cooldown, you'll be able to have Rune Tap up for every big hit. So really make sure you save one rune and one Rune Tap for this big hit. On Hungering, again, that would be the Overwhelm. If Rune Tap alone isn't enough, you can use Vampiric Blood as well for this big hit. Pairing Vampiric Blood and Rune Tap, you can pretty much survive any of these big hits that occur throughout the fights. After this big hit has occurred, this is when you want to have a Death Strike. So ideally, before the big hit, you'd be at full health or near full health. You want to make sure that before the big hit occurs, you have enough runic power so that you can Death Strike right after the big hit. So for this fight, before Overwhelm hits me, I'm making sure my health is almost at max. If it's not, I'm using a Death Strike to heal myself up. I'll then use Rune Tap and Vampiric Blood to soak the big hit. I also want to make sure that I have at least 40 runic power left after the big hit occurred in order to Death Strike back up. So that's ideally how you'd counter these active tanking situations But what happens when you're not actually tanking the boss, when the other tank has the boss? In these scenarios, you wouldn't really be taking any damage apart from any passive AoE damage that occurs throughout the fight. During this time, apart from helping out with mechanics that you may need to help with, you want to make sure that you're pooling your resources, specifically your runic power. Now, what does that mean? So since you're not taking much damage at all, you don't really need to heal yourself up with Death Strike. So instead of using Death Strikes to heal yourself up for the small amounts of damage that you're taking, you're going to want to save your runic power for when you're tanking the boss next. Only use Death Strikes when you're about to runic power cap. The goal here is by the time you're actively tanking the boss again, you want to be close to full runic power and at high stacks of Bone Shield. Also, always make sure you still have 3 runes regenerating at all times, as you do want to maximize the amount of runic power that you get. So to summarize, when off tanking the boss, you want to be pooling your resources. Don't overcap on runic power, but be close to your runic power cap by the time you're actively tanking the boss again. Also make sure that you're at 8 to 10 stacks of Bone Shield by the time you have the boss again as well. If you do this, this will put you in a great position to start taking the boss again, as you'll have 2 to 3 Death Strikes already saved up, and you should have 3 runes up as well, so you can get more runic power for more Death Strikes. You should also avoid using your cooldowns when you're not tanking the boss, as you really wouldn't need that damage reduction. If you're soaking some AoE effect on the ground, that's fine, but if you're just slapping the boss without any damage going to you, avoid using your cooldowns, let them regenerate. Now the same principles can be applied to Mythic Plus as well. Although in most cases you will be always actively tanking, there are cases where you won't be and you could be off tanking. For example, if you're playing with a druid who uses treants, or you're playing with a shaman who uses their earth elemental, you will have times of off tanking your mobs. During these off tanking times again, you want to be focusing on pooling your resources and not using your cooldowns. It's all about getting the most prepared you can be for when you'll be actively tanking the mobs again. So that's all I wanted to cover today about active tanking versus off tanking. I hope this helped you in some way differentiate between the fights in raids and knowing what you have to do in each situation. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. I really appreciate the support. Please like the video and subscribe if you liked it, and I'll see you in the next one.